Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing stories about Pensacola, Florida, North America's first place city. Today we begin a series of little episodes talking about Escambia County and life on the farm. Now, it's been a long time since one could drive down Palafox Street and see a lineup of tractors on Saturday afternoon or farm wagons parked along beside Plaza Ferdinand as families came in and literally parked over the weekend to have fun at the grocery store and in church. But we take the story back to the beginning of Pensacola in the American age. We realize that when we became part of the United States, about 90% of all people in the country lived on the farm. I'm not sure exactly what our statistic would have been about then locally, but after a few years we were probably pretty close to that. But to tell our story adequately, we have to go back actually to about the year 1752, when the Spanish settlers vacated their settlement on Santa Rosa Island and moved to the mainland after a terrible hurricane had destroyed their village. They began, of course, to set in here, and they were literally a farm community. Although I'm afraid that when the British arrived about 11 years later, and Major Farmer made an inspection and sent his report back to London, he was not very complimentary of what he saw there. He described the farms as being rather poorly done. Now, when the British took over, one of the first things that the surveyor and land planner Elias Durnford did was, in addition to laying out the city, he made a provision that every family in the community was going to have its own lot to grow their garden. And that, of course, is why we have Garden Street today. All of these lots were laid out side by side with a water takeoff from the spring, so that beginning as early as 1764, we were a gardening community. And that's basically the way things were. The people here, of course, did expand the farm community out beyond the basic perimeter of the city, but things went along pretty much that way, and also basically into the final Spanish period. Now, when we get into the period around 1817 or 18, we get some other information that helps us understand the way things were going in the community locally here. At that point in time, the United States Army, and of course remember this was still Spanish territory, the United States Army asked permission to build a road from a series of communities that were taking shape up around where Brewton, Alabama is today. This is where Fort Crawford and Bellevue and Mason and Brooklyn were taking shape as little farm communities. And these people had farm surpluses. They also had a need to import certain things which they couldn't grow. And so a road was built between those Alabama communities and Pensacola, and an exchange began. The things that were grown in Alabama were sent down here, and the things that were imported, such as coffee, were sent north. And this is the first evidence we have of a kind of a import-export trade in farm commodities. Now, when the United States took over, and of course we began having a form of government here that was kinder to this sort of thing, many of the families here who became part of the United States, people who were coming in from out of the area, began putting together what we might call sizable farm spreads. Now, the Gonzalez family was a typical example. They were up very close to Cantonment and the Gonzalez area, as we call it today, and the original family began to put out what we would call a large cattle ranch. And of course, along with that, they had to grow the feed that went with this. And from that, some of the people who worked with Mr. Gonzalez began to put together what we would call substantial farms of their own. And the idea of the family farm proceeded that way for a number of years. Now, I want to try to give you a little bit of an idea of what a typical farm would have been like as it was put together here, fairly close to Pensacola itself. The farm family, of course, first of all, had to clear the land. And that was a very, very difficult process. The trees had to be cut down, the stumps had to be pulled or burned out, and it took a lot of time and a lot of hard work to do this. And bear in mind, while there was some cooperation between farm families in helping to raise a barn, for example, by and large the family had to do this work on its own. And this, again, is why farm families of that size were fairly large. The father and the mother depended on the oncoming children to take on many of the chores that had to be be done around the farm. Now, the initial farm buildings here, of course, were very different than we see in other parts of the United States. We didn't, the farmers here didn't build mud huts as we might have seen out in the Kansas, Nebraska area. No, most of these were built of wood, very rough wood planking, being put together, the planking coming from some of the lumber mills, of course, that had started in operation here when Colonel Chase began the erection of the forts. The various mills had surplus, and the farm family could go to the mill, buy the planking that they need, and put together the outlines of the house. Now, the house itself was relatively plain. At first, of course, a few of the families might have depended upon rainwater, runoff of rainwater for their water supply, but most of them, if they were able, had a well dug or dug the well themselves, and that was their water supply, and it would be for basically the next 50 years. Now, beyond this, of course, beyond the well, of course, the family put together what we would call today a barnyard. Now, most of the farms had a barn, which of course was to handle the basic livestock that they had, and most of them would have had this. They would have had a horse, or more than one perhaps, a mule, and a few of them that were where the farmer was also doubling in work, doing a little lumbering, might also have had an oxen or two, but this would have been a little bit outside the normal. Now, in addition to that, of course, one of the most important things that the family had was a cow or two, and also they had a pig or several. Now, we can't overestimate the value of the pig to the farm family here in the period before the Civil War, and after that too, because the pig itself was just the most friendly farm animal you could think. First of all, it almost literally took care of itself. It would eat almost anything. Generally speaking, it wasn't difficult to have the farmer or the family bring the pig back into the farm area if they happened to be wandering out a little bit away from the home. And when the time came, of course, the pig could be slaughtered, and it was used for all sorts of things. First of all, of course, was the basic pork itself, which was eaten fresh for just a few days. And then, of course, most farms in this area would have had a small smokehouse where they smoked bacon and ham. From the pig came the material to make lard, which of course the homemaker was very dependent upon, and also in the fall, usually the farm family, or most of them, would also have made sausage. Now, not only was the produce of that single animal very, very valuable to the farm family itself, but if they had several pigs and had a slaughtering of more than one, often a family would have been able to sell or trade some of their surplus to the family next door, and this provided some form of bartering income for the family, which of course to them was extremely important. Now, what did they grow in the beginning? Well, basically the early farms of this area were centered upon what you would call today very basic crops. They grew corn, they grew a little wheat. Basically, they were not cotton or tobacco farmers to that point. But we'll get on to the date on which that did become a part of the farm or operation here, and that came basically about the year 1890. Now, the farm, going back again to the farm barn itself. The barn was a place where of course the animals were kept, where tools were stored. But beyond that, this also was a place where the farmer had to create a storage arrangement for silage, because if he had cattle and he grew corn, he had to depend on storing the silage from that for the feed for the cattle in the wintertime, and that again was a part of it. And this is a part of the chores that the family had to undertake to bring the silage material in, to store it and prepare it for use later on. Now, in addition to that, of course, the farm family had to depend a whole lot on what it did in handling poultry. And poultry generally was the province of the women, the farm homemaker and her daughters. In this area, they had not only chickens, but of course they raised geese and ducks as well. And this was a big part of a part of the produce that was eaten basically by the family itself. Because bear in mind, these farm families were while they were close enough to each other to maybe have 2 or 3 neighbors with whom they would deal, but basically very few of them had the opportunity to come regularly into the city for trade, because it was a long ride, and the roads at that particular time, particularly before 1870, were very poor indeed. Well, now looking again at how the homemaker operated. Now, there used to be the old adage that a man may work from sun to sun, but a woman's work is never done. Well, if you applied that slogan or that homily to the farm wife, it certainly was true, because she had a very, very difficult life. Basically, of course, when the family rose in the morning, it was her job to get breakfast of some sort ready so that everybody would be out on the farm. And usually, particularly in the summertime, this meant getting up at dawn or before, because the hours of daylight were very precious. Now, her kitchen was, of course, her empire. But the kitchen of the 1820s and 30s and 40s was very different than what we see today. There was no running water inside. Everything that she did that involved water itself had to be carried on, usually in buckets outside in the farmyard. Her stove, basically at this point in time, right up to the Civil War, would have been the fireplace, because basically that's the way the home was designed, so that she could cook within the fireplace, or in some cases, particularly when something large was being done, she very well might have worked out over an open fire in the barnyard itself with the kinds of pots and kettles that she would be able to get. Now, of course, the farm family had to depend a lot on what it could save over the winter, or for over the winter time in its dining. And so as a part of the house, there would have been what we would today call a root cellar. This was where vegetables of the kind, that root supplies that would last in a relatively cool area, were kept in a kind of underground bin. And of course, if we were doing it today, we would say, okay, that was where the refrigerator was, or where the icebox was. Well, of course, we're talking about a time before those devices had been even thought about. So basically, the farm wife had to depend on her own ability to save. Now, the farmer himself, once he had grown and harvested his grain, basically most of the farmers would have taken it in their wagons into town. And by the time we get close to the war between the states, down on Tarragona Street, there was a large building called the Goulet Mill. And this basically was a typical granary where the farmer would bring in his rough corn, and the corn would be ground and put in sacks, and he would take it back, and that basically was this. And of course, the Goulet Mill, by the way, would be around as part of the economy in Pensacola into the 20th century. It was a very big part of downtown's operation for the farmer. Now, the homemaker, of course, also had to worry about diet. And of course, if we think in terms of the way people lived in those days, the diet was, you would think, a very broad one on the farm, but most of the time it really was not. Many people, nutritionists of the 20th and 21st century, were very critical of the way many people lived in the South, because they tended to concentrate the diet on cornmeal and grits and things of that time. Lots of pork, lots of bacon and things like that were very fat. And so the diet itself was not a balanced one, although the homemaker did indeed have some vegetables of the kind we would call a balanced diet. Now, that began particularly a little bit later on. This was not the case for the farmer's wife of pre-Civil War days, but into the 1880s, a man in the Northeast, a man by the name of Atlee Washington Burpee, began the idea of putting together packets of seed, various kinds of vegetables and flowers, which he sold by mail as a business. And once the farmer had mail delivery out there, the homemaker could get all kinds of packets of seeds and for her flower beds or for her garden, and she would order these in large numbers, and of course that did balance out the diet a great deal. Burpee, of course, the Burpees are still around today, and the idea came from a man named Burpee. Of course, he had a farm at Ford Hook, Maryland, and all of this research that he did emanated from there, and it was a great benefit to the farm family.